The slaves destroyed tirelessly. Like the peasants in the Jacquerie or the Luddite wreckers, they were seeking their salvation in the most obvious way. The destruction of what they knew was the cause of their sufferings. And if they destroyed much, it was because they had suffered much. From their masters they had known rape, torture, degradation, and at the slightest provocation, death. They returned in kind. They, whose women had undergone countless violations, violated all the women who fell into their hands, often on the bodies of their still bleeding husbands, fathers, and brothers. Vengeance, vengeance was their war cry, and one of them carried a white child on a pike as a standard. And yet they were surprisingly moderate then and afterwards, far more humane than their masters had been or would ever be to them.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time around we're going to be beginning our cluster on revolutions with C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins.
Yeah, I'm so excited. And you were saying cluster on revolutions. And, I always think of it as a cluster on revolution. And that's kind of a neat distinction, right? Are they different things or is it always the same thing that crops up in different moments?
Very good. That's very good. Well, I'm sure we'll be getting to talk about that over the course of our books. But first off, let's start with a little question. This is not a novel. It is a history book. It is a straight up history book. So why are we reading this? Is history writing a kind of literature?
Well, these categories are kind of arbitrary, right? Like, there's a lot of history books that are not literature. Like, they have useful content. This is what I think anyway, right? They have useful content, but they're not like beautiful or moving or things you would read, decades or even hundreds of years after they're written. But there are certain history books that we do that with, like, classical literature or even, something like the Shahnameh, which is the Persian Epic of Kings, right? It's a historical book. It's poetic, but it's also historical, right? Or things like, Carlyle's French Revolution, which is something we considered using for this cluster, or at least I considered it. I don't know if I asked you about it. Or Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Empire, right? So there's history books that kind of do something literary, and it's kind of it's a line we draw, right?
Whenever this topic comes up, I think about the two books that so often people talk about when they think about literariness and history writing, which is the ancient Greek texts by Herodotus, the Histories, and Thucydides, the History of the Peloponnesian War. And Herodotus is much more literary. It's much more playful. It's much more telling you a good story for the sake of a good story. It does have an overall point, but you're along for the ride. And Thucydides is a much more technical blow-by-blow about the Peloponnesian War.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried to read both of them. And I have read and thoroughly loved Herodotus, and I kind of hope we do him someday.
Uh-huh.
And boy, Thucydides is dry.
Oh.
It's really rough. And I have to say, in general, I have a lot of difficulty with that kind of history writing.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of difficulty with this book.
Yeah.
Which isn't even as dry as some of history writing books can be.
Yeah. I found this book really hard to read too, in a way that I think is very different from your experience. Like, I loved reading it, but I found myself bewildered a lot of the time. It was like a whole nother world. There was like this just like horizon upon horizon in there, because the historical content was, stuff that I didn't know a lot about. So it was really widening, what I knew about that period in time. But also what James is doing is so interesting in terms of, he's not just giving a historical account of the Haitian Revolution. He's also giving account of the conditions that led to those circumstances, and also foreshadowing a whole range of things that would happen, not only in Haiti, but in other parts of the world. In other words, how the phenomenon of revolution works. And so on the one hand, it's about a very specific set of historical circumstances. On the other hand, it's a way of talking about a much wider set of concerns. So I found myself like, when I read for one of our episodes, I usually fold pages over and pencil and marks them. My copy of this book is like so dog-eared and so folded and so scribbled on. And sometimes when I do that, that means, I have a total grasp on this book and I'm ready to talk about it at length and very clearly and very coherently. And in this case, it's like I have a lot of feelings about it, and I there's some passages I'd want to draw us to, but I feel like it's there's an awful lot there.
I agree. One of the things I did get out of the book was some of the things you're describing when I could trace the connections between the arguments he was making about the Haitian Revolution and the fight for decolonialization in the West Indies and also in Africa. Like, those were some very interesting and exciting moments. And the way that he talked about that period and recentered the narrative that I do know about somewhat of the French Revolution and told that story from a very different perspective than the one I'm familiar with. And I wish that I had been able to follow the book more and get more out of it, because I could tell he was doing something interesting with that.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think, one of the most compelling and interesting features of this book is that it retells the story. It does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is it retells the story of the French Revolution from, I want to say the periphery, but what I really mean is from the colony, right? And normally when we're reading about the French Revolution, it's all about Paris, right? And we may get a little bit about what's happening out in the cities and towns elsewhere, but it's very centered on the capital, right? This is an account of the revolution that almost in a sense indicates that the truest expression of revolution, the sort of ultimate test case of how far liberty, equality, and brotherhood we're going to go, takes place not in the national capital so much as it takes place in the periphery, where because of the histories of race and the histories of slavery, the challenges and the possibilities are infinitely greater. So it's almost like it tells the story of the French Revolution in a totally different framework and lets you see the full flowering of it in a certain sense. At least I found that really amazing.
Well, let's talk a little bit about C.L.R. James, the person. He's really interesting. I had not actually heard of him until you mentioned this book, and you were very excited about it and about him. And I didn't know anything about him the first time you mentioned him. And having read up on him a bit, he's a really interesting person and a really interesting writer and from what I can tell, a really interesting thinker.
Actually, I first heard of him in connection not with this book, but with another book of his, which is about sports, bizarrely enough.
Yeah, which we'll get to in a bit. So he was born in Trinidad in 1901, and he was obsessed as a child with basically two things: cricket, the sport, and literature. He had a particular fondness for Thackeray's Vanity Fair, and it seems like he just read it again and again and again. And so as he got older, he got involved in local publishing in Trinidad and also got more and more interested in anti-colonial activism. In 1932, he moved to England to help Leary Constantine, who's a famous cricketer, I guess. I don't know anything about cricket, but helped him with his autobiography. And he arrived in England with a manuscript for the one novel that he had published, which is called Minty Alley, and for his first nonfiction book, which is called The Life of Captain Cipriani or Cipriani. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but an abridged version of that nonfiction book was published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf's Hogarth Press, interestingly enough, as The Case for West Indian Self-Government. So you see, these are the two sides of him that he's really thinking about, as well as cricket. But in England, he got to meet with a bunch of people. He got to host long discussion groups with various Marxist thinkers in particular, and he became even more invested in the causes of West Indian and African liberation. So shortly after he arrived in England, he wrote a play called Toussaint L'Ouverture, the story of the only successful slave revolt in history. And that got produced, I believe, the West End in 1934 with Paul Robeson in the leading role. And that was the first professional production in Britain of a play written by a black author starring black actors. That refrain comes up a lot in his autobiography. His novel was the first novel published in England by a black author from the West Indies.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah, he did a lot of things first. He was at that cusp of the moment where these things suddenly became more possible, I guess. But the play, Toussaint L'Ouverture, serves as kind of a warm-up for the book that we're looking at today, The Black Jacobins, which came out in 1938, and as we'll discuss, it's a history of the Haitian Revolution, and Toussaint L'Ouverture, who is the main actor in that. So after the publication of the book, he ended up moving to the United States, and he did a lot of Marxist political activism there until he was deported in 1953, sort of at the height of McCarthyism, right? And while he was being deported, he was detained for a while on Ellis Island, and he was trying to not be deported. And while he was there, one of his strategies for doing this, you will love this, is that he wrote a book about Herman Melville.
This makes me so happy.
It's called Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, the story of Herman Melville and the world we live in. And I haven't read it, but I understand that it uses Moby Dick to talk about McCarthyism, which, sure.
Absolutely.
Oh, so good. Anyway, he was deported back to the UK. He had some travels. Eventually, he returned to Trinidad, planning to stay there for just a few months, but ending up there for several years, getting involved in anti-colonialist efforts in the West Indies and Africa. And that's when he published the book Beyond a Boundary, which explores colonialism through a combination of autobiography and studies of famous cricketers, which is super interesting.
Yeah, and people talk about this book as being a tremendously wonderful example of sports writing, like the best sports book ever, and also one of the most extraordinary books about the colonial experience in the West Indies and the post-colonial environment.
Yeah.
So a combination you do not often find.
No, it's a really striking way to go about that.
Mm.
Eventually, in the 60s, he was allowed back in the U.S. He taught for several years there. Several decades, really, before finally returning to the UK, and he passed away in 1989. So quite a life.
Yeah, extraordinary.
Just phenomenal.
Yeah, I think we're not going to be done with James after today. I think we may come back to him again at some point, whether it's in connection with sports or whatever. I think we're going to have to come back to him.
So that's James. Why don't we talk a little bit about, well, I guess the plot of the book is just the Haitian Revolution, but I guess I didn't know a lot about that going into it, except that it happened. And I don't know, it sounded like you were saying that you didn't know nearly as much about it going in.
Well, I was really interested in the Haitian Revolution. Like, I'm really interested in revolution in general and really interested in revolutionary time. Like, what is it that people think is going on when revolution is happening, right? And often that's only kind of fully understood retrospectively when people look back upon it. So I'm really interested in kind of the time of revolution, right? And so when we were talking first about doing a cluster on revolution, at first I thought, oh, we'll do something on the French Revolution and on the Soviet Revolution, the big obvious ones, right? But instead we're doing it in a slightly different kind of way, which I think is so creative and exciting, starting with this book that is dealing with the Haitian Revolution, which is, we were saying earlier, also a way of talking about the French Revolution, not just because of the kinds of negotiations that were going on throughout the period that's chronicled in James's Black Jacobins, but also the ways in which the revolutionary impulse gets expressed, you could argue, most fully in this environment. In other words, the revolution plays out much more dramatically, much more fully when you're down in Haiti, which I think so I was sort of excited about. So I didn't know a lot of the details about the circumstances of the revolution, but I knew a fair amount about the French Revolution. So I had a kind of a foundation to think about there. So the book itself is, as we were saying, kind of chronicles the period of the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1803. Plus, the opening chapters give you a rich sense of the founding of the colony of San Domingo and the ways in which it evolved over time leading up to the outbreak of revolution. But the book also has a sort of complex relationship to time. We're in a number of different times in the book, and that happens on two levels. One is that, as you were saying earlier, the book comes out in 1938, right? And then there's a second edition that James wrote a new preface for and also put some new notes in for in 1963. He wrote the preface in 62, but the book comes out in 63. So the book is itself in those two different moments. But then also throughout the book, we get references to other revolutionary moments, to the Soviet Revolution of 1917, which is backward in time, like not all that far backward in time, just like over 20 years, if you're thinking about when the book was first published in 1939. But it's forward in time if you're thinking about the Haitian Revolution taking place around 1800, right? And then also there's these references to African nationalism, the revolutionary impulse there, right, in the post-colonial setting, which is waiting in the future from the perspective of the 1938 first edition, but is actively underway in a really dynamic kind of sense when the second edition comes out. So there's all these different time references, right? So the 1938 point of view is looking back to the Soviet Revolution and also forward to World War II, which is just about to happen. And he refers to this in the preface to the 1938 edition.
One of the interesting things about that is that, as you're saying this, it's making me wonder, from his perspective, like it feels very prescient that he's writing about World War II, although I guess it was pretty close to happening.
Yeah, it's 38, right? Yeah.
But did that feel like a kind of revolution or a potential revolution, even if it's a disastrous one?
Well, what I think what he's doing, and there's a really good, let me find a little passage that illuminates that. In the preface to the first edition in 1938, he writes, Tranquility today is either innate or to be acquired only by a deliberate doping of the personality. It was in the stillness of a seaside suburb that could be heard most clearly and insistently the booming of Franco's heavy artillery, the rattle of Stalin's firing squads, and the fierce, shrill turmoil of the revolutionary movement striving for clarity and influence. Such is our age, and this book is of it. This book is the history of a revolution, and written under different circumstances, it would have been a different, but not necessarily a better book. So the Franco and Stalin and so on, that's the movement of European nations that is kind of concurrent or precipitates the revolutionary impulse. So in the same way, when he's talking about the Haitian Revolution, he talks about Britain and Spain and how they're functioning vis-a-vis France in the wake of the revolution, right, in France. And those national conflicts in Europe have an impact through their colonies over in the West Indies, right? And that's the framework within which the Haitian Revolution takes place. And so he's kind of drawing a parallel there with World War II. You have Russia and Germany and you have all these other nations, and what they're doing is being felt and being played out in another kind of register in their colonies. There, I think he's talking about Africa. So it's not so much a question of revolution in the European countries. That's not the issue. The issue is what can happen in the colonies and former colonies.
Well, okay. So back to Haiti.
So in terms of as I said, sort of what's covered in the book is the circumstance of the Haitian Revolution. So I'm just going to say a little bit about that. So the French Revolution, when it takes place, there's this whole question of how far it can go. Who all is going to be included? Are the enslaved people of the colonies going to be included? Like, who counts as a man in the context of revolution, right? If men are free, right? Does it include men and women? How does that play out? Does it include all men? And how does race play into it? Are slaves men for the purpose of the revolution? And so that whole question of how the French revolutionary government was going to come down on that side is a really important part of what's unfolding in the account of the Haitian Revolution here. So as you were mentioning, European nations are involved, especially Britain and Spain, because their colonies are proxy for that national conflict, right? So the island on which Haiti is situated. Right now it's Haiti to the west, Dominican Republic to the east. And in the time of the Haitian Revolution that's being chronicled here, you have Spanish settlement over in the east, French settlement over in the west, right? And the revolutionary activity takes off in the west, but will ultimately extend to include the whole island of San Domingo in the course of the action. So the French revolutionary government waffles for a little while about this question of, are people who are of mixed race, right, or Black people, are they fully included in the liberation that the government is promulgating? Are slaves included? And so they finally come down and they abolish slavery and extends that level of fraternity completely. And the national conflict goes on. The Spanish end up withdrawing from the eastern side of the island. The British are involved because they're trying to work against the French. And the revolutionary armies in Haiti that get mustered and develop over time ally with different factions at different moments in order to further the cause of the formerly enslaved people of the island. Right? And so throughout the Black Jacobins, this very complex storyline, right, this historical narrative, gets focused and controlled through the figure of Toussaint L'Ouverture, who was in James's account and generally is seen as the key figure of the revolution in terms of leadership, in terms of military might, and also in terms of consolidating rule and stability within the emergent republic, in spite of all the chaos, right, that was going on. And as the narrative goes on, the next big turn that happens, independence is becoming greater, but then once Napoleon ascends to power in France, efforts begin to return San Domingo back to a state of slavery. And there's resistance, and ultimately, after a certain amount of negotiating and also military conflict, we end with the capture of Toussaint L'Ouverture. And in spite of his capture and ultimately death while he's captured, other leaders, especially General Dessalines, resist, and then the French end up getting driven out. And that's where we end with the narrative. We don't hear about the later sequel, though James includes a sort of an appendix that talks about other historical moments and kind of suggests that the story goes on some level. And for James, one of the things that I think is really compelling, really literary about the book, even though it's a history that has two protagonists, I think. And one of them is Toussaint L'Ouverture, and we could talk about that. But also the revolution itself is almost like a character, like it shows up and it has agency and it makes things happen. And I find that also kind of neat.
Yeah, the book takes a really interesting approach in thinking about this historical event by thinking about both sort of the outside factors, the sort of large systemic things that drive people to do things en masse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things are out of any individual's control, and some of these things seem like they're going to happen because the forces of history are moving upon it. But then you also have this individual, Toussaint, who is absolutely necessary and a potential person who could have emerged at that moment, but
Mm-hmm.
not a necessary person to have emerged, so to speak. And it's not that is it that his personality really drives the way, or is he just phenomenally fit for the role?
Well, James says something really neat about this in his preface to the first edition. He talks about how difficult it is to write history. And he says, we tend to often think about social forces, great men being merely or nearly instruments in the hands of economic destiny. As so often, the truth does not lie in between. Great men make history, but only such history as it is possible for them to make. Right. So he talks about how there's this kind of impulse toward revolution, but also there's extraordinary figures that are thrown up by these circumstances. So he says, with the single exception of Bonaparte himself, no single figure appeared on the historical stage more greatly gifted than this man, a slave until he was 45. Yet Toussaint did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Toussaint. And even that is not the whole truth. So there's a lot of neat stuff going on there, right? First, this idea of the historical stage. And I think that metaphor, right, is really powerful here. And not just because James wrote a play about Toussaint L'Ouverture before he wrote this book. Like there's this sense in which you can only give a full accounting of the historical past by dramatizing it in some way. Like that's part of bringing it alive. Because history isn't just about recording facts of the past, or at least not for James. It's also about impelling action in the future, I think. So I think that's what's going on there, right? So that there has to be that figure. There has to be that kind of heroic figure, because it's not just about giving a chronicle of the past. It's also doing something. And that figure is necessary to do it.
That's really interesting. And this idea of revolution and Toussaint being the two main characters, which, you know, in that passage you just read from the preface, is laid out, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're in collaboration and in a relationship with each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But maybe he is also particularly interested in that, right? I mean, he's doing a lot of things in this book. He's trying to make a change into the way people talk about the Haitian Revolution and talk about Toussaint and talk about the French Revolution, which he's found deeply dissatisfying and awfully racist in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And he's trying to think about and do the work towards decolonialization in Africa and the West Indies. Mm-hmm. But also he's got this thesis about the way that great individuals and the forces of history relate to one another that he's, I guess, teasing out throughout the course of the book.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that shows up is in how he refers to Toussaint L'Ouverture a couple of different times as the Black Spartacus. And this happens in, one of the times this happens is in a passage where he's describing Toussaint's features. He was as completely master of his body as of his mind. He slept but 2 hours every night, and for days would be satisfied with 2 bananas and a glass of water. Physically without fear, he had to guard against being poisoned, and so on. Talks about his physical bravery that made men follow him. He seemed to bear a charmed life, and he describes how he avoids these various assassination attempts and says, no wonder he came in the end to believe in himself as the Black Spartacus, foretold as predestined to achieve the emancipation of the blacks. The laborers in their turn worshipped him as a direct servant of God. So this idea of a Black Spartacus, that is someone who rises up to lead a kind of slave revolt, is one of the ways in which he frames the sort of heroic side of Toussaint L'Ouverture. But he's representing here not just the slave revolt, but something else, right? Revolution, right? And there's a distinction there, right? It's one thing to be in a state of enslavement and to revolt, to run away, to flee subjugation, right? And torment. It's another thing to turn it all over and develop a new government and replace the old government with something new. And that's something that James takes real pains to depict here. Not just the military victories and, you know, the kinds of subjugation of their former masters, right? But the establishment of a highly functional government with well-defined, like he talks about hotels reopening and, you know, what the tax rate is like and, you know, and how the commodities are coming in and out. In other words, he establishes a new order. So I think you were saying that James is doing a lot of different things. And among those different things he's doing is he's using Toussaint L'Ouverture to tell this story in more than one way. So it's partly about a Spartacus-like figure, a heroic figure, but it's partly about, as I said, the revolution as itself a kind of character, or itself a force that moves forward of its own volition together with the people who are engaged in it. It's really complicated and fascinating.
So that passage that you just read out, where James talks about how little he sleeps and how little he eats and a few other things along those lines, that sounded a lot like hagiography to me. That sounded a lot like the sort of things you encounter in saints' lives where they...
Oh, wait, I have a much better one. Yeah, no, you're right. Did you notice the orphan child passage?
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay, this is a really good one. Okay, so it's part of a long description of Toussaint L'Ouverture, a chapter called The Black Consul. And it says, he loved children and they loved him. Riding one day from Gonièvre to Ennery, a little orphan named Rose, 10 years of age, ran after him calling, Papa, Papa, take me away with you. He dismounted, took her up and carried her home to his wife. Here is an orphan who has just called me her father. I have accepted the title, accept also the title of her mother. And Rose became a member of the L'Ouverture household. It goes on. These kinds of things came naturally to him, as also did his respect for old people to whom he always gave way in the street. He loved music and always had flowers in his room.
So, okay.
It's moving, right? I know you're right. It is hagiographical, though, too. It is, in that passage, right? It's idealizing, but he also exposes his flaws and his limitations. Right? So it's not pure. There are hagiographical moments, right? But there are also other kinds of moments as well.
So do those moments of treating him like a mystical saint who can do these quasi-magical things. I don't know if it ever quite goes that far, but still, these very unlikely impressive things. Do you think that, what's going on there? That seems to my ears like it would cut against his argument that he's making this person much too much larger than life and representing that as fact when it could, I'm sure that's what some of the reports said about it. But is that true? Should he take that with a bit more of a grain of salt in representing it to us?
Well, he's trying to give an account for why the people were devoted to him the way they were. So I think that those passages that, sometimes seem almost over the top, they almost seem excessive, they're explaining why it was that people, followed him in the way that they did. And he doesn't hesitate to give you a sense of the limitations that Toussaint L'Ouverture has too. When James describes the ways in which Toussaint L'Ouverture was limited or problems, what he talks about a lot is his silence, which is really interesting. He talks about how he doesn't always fully explain to the people around him what his thinking is, what his planning is. And that's the thing that ultimately leads to his downfall. And James foreshadows that at certain moments. So when Napoleon Bonaparte has come to power and there's this effort coming from the center, the sort of colonial center to reimpose slavery in the colonies, including San Domingo, Toussaint is responding to this, and he responds to Bonaparte defiantly. And James says this, Toussaint had burnt his boats. With vision, courage, and determination, he was laying the foundations of an independent nation. But too confident in his own powers, he was making one dreadful mistake. In nothing does his genius stand out so much as in refusing to trust the liberties of the blacks to the promises of French or British imperialism. His error was his neglect of his own people. They did not understand what he was doing or where he was going. He took no trouble to explain. It was dangerous to explain, but still more dangerous not to explain. Right? So when James gives these critical assessments, or else these sort of hagiographical, very beautiful passages, what he's trying to account for is Toussaint's relationship to the people. They follow him, right? They're committed to him. They'll go with him anywhere. But there comes a point when it all falls apart. And so James is trying to give an account of both of these things. And I think those passages kind of give you a sense of it.
That also sounds very specifically like a pointed warning to future revolutionary leaders.
Yeah,
that you
I think
can't
you're right about
leave
that.
your people in the dark about what you're doing.
Yeah, you're 100% right, because that passage I was reading, at the end of that same paragraph, it says this. It quotes Dessalines, one of the other generals, who at that time was sort of a lieutenant to Toussaint L'Ouverture, and he's the one who's going to ultimately bring Haiti to independence and get the French out after Toussaint L'Ouverture has been captured. And so it quotes Dessalines saying, "The war you've just won is a little war, but you have two more bigger ones, one against the Spaniards and the other against France, who will try to make you slaves again. We'll win those wars," right? And then that's the end of the quote from Dessalines. And James says this: "That was and still is the way to speak to the masses, and it is no accident that Dessalines and not Toussaint finally led the island to independence. Toussaint, shut up within himself, immersed in diplomacy, went his tortuous way, overconfident that he had only to speak and the masses would follow." Right? So you're absolutely right. I mean, that passage is, in a way, it's about the Haitian Revolution, but in a way, it's about the future.
So I'm curious, from like a literary perspective, what was most exciting to you about this book? Was it the complicated depiction of Toussaint? Was it particularly dramatic passages? Was it turns of phrase that really stuck with you?
I mean, it's beautifully written. It's very evocative. Those things, those turns of phrase are part of. But the thing that most strikes me, and this may sound kind of dry to other people, but I just find this absolutely enchanting, is the multiple time frames. Is the extent to which he's talking about the historical past, but he's also talking about the present moment. You know, the two different present moments of the first edition and the second edition, and also the future. You know, and it's history writing that's about giving an account of the past, but it's also about shaping the future. And I find that so fascinating, that it's inhabiting these different periods, right? It's inhabiting these different relationships to time. And that's why I think of it as, like, on the one hand, a history book, but also something entirely different. And then also, like, the writing is really beautiful in places. And sometimes very painful and awful, right? When he's describing the kinds of atrocities that people were suffering in the years of enslavement leading up to the Haitian Revolution. So the literary qualities of it are partly in the language itself, like the powerful, beautiful, sometimes awful quality of the language, but also I think in that structure, that extraordinary time structure. I mean, that is like literary in a sense, right? It's formal. And he does like weird stuff in places, like things that are kind of, I think, literary features. And it's hard to know exactly what he's trying to do with them sometimes. Like one example, and I don't know if you noticed it, there's this one moment, it's on page 152 in the edition that I think we both have, a chapter called The Rise of Toussaint. And all of a sudden it goes from being in the past tense, which it is all the time, into the present tense. So here's what happens. At the first hint of insurrection, Toussaint would go himself. The most difficult districts were around, and describes the different districts, destined to hold the first place to the end. Early in 1796, for instance, he hears one day that the laborers of Port-de-Paix have taken arms and massacred some whites. In one night, he covers the long distance from Verret to Port-de-Paix. He calls the blacks together and gives them address on the way they should conduct themselves. If they have grievances, assassination is not the way to have them redressed. One of them speaks for the rest. And then it goes on. There's a kind of an exchange. And here is how it comes to an end. Next day, Toussaint calls a meeting of all the blacks in the district. He makes them swear to work hard and be obedient. He appoints a commander. The laborers cried, "Long live the Republic, long live liberty, long live equality, long live Governor Lavaux, long live Toussaint L'Ouverture." They danced and cheered Toussaint when he left. So it's super weird, right? Because you have this normative past tense, which the whole book is in, right? And then, for example, he does this thing. For instance, he hears one day that this has happened. He goes, he talks to them, he talks them down, he calls a meeting, he makes them swear, and they cry out, "Long live the Republic, long live liberty, long live equality." And then it goes into the past tense immediately. They danced and cheered. So it's almost like the revolutionary moment, right? Something happens, right? This breaks out, right? This conflict breaks out, this violence breaks out, right? That's the impulse toward revolution. And then Toussaint comes in and gives it form. He talks them down. He straightens it out. He gives them a framework within which to express the revolutionary impulse. And they're all, "Long live the Republic," right? And then it goes back into the past tense. Yes, I find, like, that's the kind of thing I find super interesting.
The other thing about that passage, and I'm not taking away from your point, I hope, when I say this, is that that's a really unusual section for this book. I don't know what the source is, but usually when James gives people dialogue, it's directly from a source. It seems it's usually from letters, or it's usually from documents that he has. And it feels like this is actually one of the few times he does that historian trick is the wrong word, I guess, but that historian move of providing dialogue to people, putting words in people's mouths, setting a little scene.
You know, it'd be super cool would be to check the play. You know, the play that comes out in 1934. I wonder if there's a scene like that.
Yeah.
That would be cool. That would be really neat to know.
It would. Was that a kitty?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's okay.
That's an audience. Yeah, and like this whole question of the time of revolution shows up elsewhere as well. Like, there's no other example that I ran across where we move into the present tense, but you do have these moments of like anticipation and like tension. And a really good example of this happens when Napoleon Bonaparte is coming on the scene, right? So just before the first time we hear about Bonaparte, this is how we lead into it. This is in a chapter called Toussaint Seizes the Power. So there's a city that was blockaded. The war at last rested on the fate of Jacmel, blockaded by land and sea. For 5 months, Jacmel held out. The besieged ate horses, dogs, cats, rats, old leather, the grass in the streets, until there was nothing more to eat. They fought irresolutely, waiting for France. At last, Jacmel could hold out no longer. The starving garrison cut its way through Dessalines' men, and Toussaint's ultimate victory grew nearer. Next sentence. Bonaparte, victorious in the internal struggle of the bourgeoisie for power, was still too busy in Europe to deal with San Domingo. But he comes on. So there's this sense of like the besieged location, right? The sort of threshold of the victory of the revolution. Napoleon appears in that moment, right? Because he's going to be the one who's going to mount this invasion to try to restore slavery in the island, right? So the sort of time aspect emerges, now and then in the sense of anticipation and like of things moving, like people move and do things, but like things are moving too. The sense that, I don't know, it's like riding on waves or something like that, right? Like you maybe steer to some extent, right? You have some control, but there's all this movement around you. I mean, that's the world that I think James is describing.
Well, to bring it down a notch, just to make it more earthly, one of my favorite moments of this kind of cross-temporal play is a moment that reminded me a little bit of some of the moments that we saw in MFK Fisher's How to Cook a Wolf, where she would interrupt the text. Now, he never interrupts the main text, but there are some footnotes that, as you say, reposition or explain things from his point of view in 1962 or 3 when he's revising this for a second edition.
And sometimes it's informational, but sometimes it's really pointed.
Well, exactly. And that's what I was going to bring up, because the cold open that you started with, that really gorgeous passage and haunting passage and terrible passage about the slaves destroying, and then the terrible things that the slaves do over the course of the fighting, and the horrible things that they've undergone, but the horrible things that they do, even to the point of carrying a child on a pike as a standard, which is just an awful image. And then it ends with, as you said, and yet they were surprisingly moderate then and afterwards, far more humane than their masters had been or ever would be to them. And there's a footnote to that line. Which is a delightful footnote. This statement has been criticized. I stand by it. And then his initials.
I love the way he signs it with his initials. He doesn't always do that in the notes. That's just a really nice way of saying, I put my name to this. Like, I really... And he enlarges on that a little later on in the same passage, describing the kinds of violent acts that took place in the course of revolution. But he describes it and doesn't hold back. But then he says, compared with what their masters had done to them in cold blood, what they did was negligible. And they were spurred on by the ferocity with which the whites in Le Cap treated all slave prisoners who fell in their hands. So, I mean, I don't know, like how we want to talk about that, like justifying violence, right? I mean, what he's saying is that in conditions that are so extreme and so atrocious, this is the sequel. This is what comes out of that. And these kinds of atrocities are like, don't even measure up even close to the kinds of things that were being experienced before the time of the revolution.
So that, but also, this is an argument that's being made in response to other historians.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a book that I think, as I recall, points out a few times that a lot of the history of the Haitian Revolution doesn't take slavery seriously, always tries to minimize the effects of slavery, and always says that line about, there were some bad ones, but most of the slave keepers were pretty good. It wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
And so he's pushing back against that in the original book, but he's continuing to push against that in this footnote. It's a very firm, and appropriately so. No, that's not true. That narrative of the good slave keeper is not true. These terrible stories that we have some account of are much more the norm than they are aberration.
No, I think that's exactly right. And again, thinking about the historical context, right? The time in which he's writing, 1938, right? Like thinking about what are the social conditions? What are the norms that he's pushing back against? And what are the comfortable narratives of that past that he's, not having any truck with? I find that really interesting.
There's also, sort of on a similar line, there's also a fun bibliography at the end of it, where he's not afraid to be catty.
No.
And I just appreciate that sort of thing. I appreciate a good firm footnote, and I appreciate a bibliography that's willing to say this is a really good and important book, and this one is just Tory nonsense or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing he does too in that book, we were talking about the ways in which the book positions itself in time. The closing chapter, before that bibliography you mentioned, the closing chapter really makes it clear what the forward gaze of this book is directed to. So as he's closing out his account of Haiti, he says, the blacks of Africa are more advanced, nearer ready than were the slaves of San Domingo. And then he quotes from a letter by a person called Loveway. He says, such men as Loveway are symbols of the future. Others will arise, and others. From the people heaving in action will come the leaders. Right? So he's looking very directly at this kind of future for Africa. He says the African faces a long and difficult road, and he will need guidance, but he will tread it fast because he will walk upright. He's writing to give an account of the past, but he's also writing to sort of inspire things in the future, in whether you're talking about the West Indies, whether you're talking about the U.S. as well. I mean, he doesn't talk about America very often in here, but there are certain moments where he does, where you get the sense that the implications of the narrative he's giving, that you could fold out the implications of that in the North American and specifically the American U.S. setting. So he kind of gestures toward that. The main focus looking toward the future in this book is toward Africa, right? African nationalism. But I think there's other resonances to the book too. And I think readers have responded to that. I mean, that's one of the things that's neat about this book. It's a book that had a huge amount of impact, not just as a really important historical text and folding out the history of the Haitian Revolution and the implications that you could draw out of the French Revolution more broadly as it plays out in the colonies, but also just in terms of shaping a post-colonial perspective on the past, right? So this is a book that's had a huge amount of influence, I think, in different ways.
So I was having some trouble reading this book, as I mentioned. And while I did enjoy some parts of it, for the most part, it felt like I was turning pages and reading text and occasionally finding really interesting things, but mostly it just wasn't going into me. And that was unfortunate because it seemed like a very interesting book, and it is a very interesting book.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm glad I got to read it. I'm glad I got to hear you talk about it more. And I'm sure many of our listeners will get very excited about this book. But I decided that bouncing off kind of wasn't fair. And I thought, okay, well, let me try reading one of his other books.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to read Beyond a Boundary, which is his autobiography / political analysis / cricket book. Now, I don't know anything about cricket. I know a little tiny bit in that I could name a famous cricketer, one, but
Yeah.
and the book does offer a very handy guide to terminology about cricket that's going to come up in the book, and like the basics of what the game is. That's great. It's useful. It didn't make reading the sections that were deeply about cricket any easier, but the book was fabulous. The book is absolutely great, and I'm kind of thinking that we should at some point come back to this book and look at it more deeply, because it is a really interesting and compelling combination of, as it says, autobiography and sports and colonial analysis.
That's exciting. I think we should do a sports cluster.
The book is broken up into a bit of autobiography, and then it goes into, here are some chapters about famous cricketers, some that he'd known, some that he'd read about, because he reads a lot about cricket, of course. And you'd be reading it, and there's a section where it's, okay, I don't really know. He's describing a game. He's describing the style of this player's play and so forth. And then, for me, as somebody who's not a cricket fan, I sort of am starting to skim. I'm starting to have it not go into my head again. And then suddenly he talks about why this had to happen given the situation, given the historical situation, given the racialized world that these people were living in, why this was what it was like.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a fabulous analysis for seeing all this through.
Wow.
There's a section where he describes each of the different clubs on Trinidad and what their origins are and what their players, because he's trying to find a club that he can play in as a 18-year-old. And like, well, it can't be in this club because that club's just for white people. It's for the master class, so to speak. And then it can't be in this club because it was founded on colorism. It was founded on the idea that people with very dark skin wouldn't be allowed in. And he had very dark skin. So he can't be part of that. So there's like only one club for him to go into, but it's not very good. And it's just like, okay, so he's got this complicated situation. He's navigating it. And it's just like, yeah, if you're thinking the right way, if you've got your mind set to notice these things, and if you have sensitive thoughts about them, you can basically approach anything through these lenses. But he navigates it so deftly, and it's such sparkling writing that I really want us to do this book. I'm very excited about it.
That's so good. Yeah, and it strikes me as you're describing it that in some ways, like, it shows the same ability to navigate between the very complex and detailed account of social and cultural change, right, in a very detailed way, but doing that with a kind of a through line, or how can I put it, giving you a way to navigate through that through human experience. And in Black Jacobins, it's the figure of Toussaint L'Ouverture. And in Beyond a Boundary, it's his own autobiographical experience, right? Like, it gives you a vehicle to move through that thick history.
Yeah, it's his autobiography, but also the stories of these cricketers, some of whom are long dead, some of whom he interacted with in life. Like, they're little potted stories, but they often break off in the most interesting ways.
That sounds awesome.
Did you have a chance to look at the Melville book?
I looked at it just a little bit, just enough to be like, this is amazing. I have to read it.
Yes.
So,
I can't wait. Maybe
we can just do a cluster that's just books responding to Moby Dick.
We could.
I would be totally happy with that.
I'm sure. There are plenty out there, I suppose. We'll
only do the very best ones.
We have to, listeners, if you have a particular favorite book that was inspired by Moby Dick that we should look at someday, write in, let us know.
Then we want to, yes.
And there's also the play that came out before this, which, again, I didn't have a chance to look at. I'm super curious about what it's even like.
Yeah, and also to take a peek at that scene we were talking about, that present tense scene that you were pointing out was so anomalous. It'd be neat to see if there's something like that in the play.
Someone made it into a radio play, I believe in the 70s for the BBC, which also sounds interesting, although I couldn't find a recording of it. Maybe it's out there. Maybe smarter people than I can find it. And it looks like somebody's optioned this book for a TV series.
That would be incredible.
Which is really interesting. I will have links in the show notes for more information about this. But like, the idea of optioning this book, as opposed to just doing a series about the Haitian Revolution, but like specifically thinking about this book, I guess I don't really know how these movies that are based on history books actually function in terms of how that influences the script. But boy, this could be really interesting.
It could be amazing.
I'm super excited to see what comes of that. Hopefully something does.
And presumably they'd pick up the narrative Toussaint L'Ouverture, and like those memorable moments that we were like plucking out earlier. But then you wonder, why wouldn't they use the play as a sort of framework, right, to work out from? So we need to keep an eye on that.
Well, maybe they got both. Maybe this book has greater recognition that it's more useful to say that it came from this. But I don't know. True. Super interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing more about it. Well, I hope listeners do check out a bit of C.L.R. James, especially if you like history books. Obviously, this is fantastic for you. If you're not addled like me with the inability to read most history books.
And I thought also the opening chapters that lead up to the time of the Revolution, those were, I thought, really striking. They give you a really rich, nuanced sense of that environment, that colonial environment, and how the pressure kind of built up over time. I think those are really powerful.
Yeah. But also, if you're not a history book person, check out other books by C.L.R. James. He's an interesting guy. And there's something for most people there, I suspect.
Yeah.
What are we doing next time?
We're going to do Upton Sinclair's The Jungle.
Ooh, which I've been meaning to read forever, but I've never read it. You've read this one before, right?
I'd read it as a young person and loved it, so I'm going to be eager to see how I respond to it this time.
Excellent. Well, until we do that, if anyone would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/24, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.